Hey, welcome back to Pappy Tinkers and my weathering series. Since I don't have a shop cart, my friend John over at Amateur Scale Model Building made this one for me. I think this is so cool. Thank you, John. Oh, and while I'm thinking about it, if I got a shop card from you and haven't done a shout out, don't worry, I've finally figured out how I want to display your cards and do my shout outs. Now on to what you've been waiting for. If you recall, in the last episode we had left you looking at a terrible mess. And it dries even worse, as you'll see as I put another coat of primer on this. I know some of you are saying, wait a sec, Pappy, you've already primed this a couple times. Well, that's true, but remember, weathering is a layering process, and all we're doing is building up those layers. The red-brown primer is meant to represent the rusty bare metal, so now we're building on top of that. Every car, as it's manufactured, is primed before it's painted, so that's what this coat represents. For this step, you can use a fine primer like Mr. Surfacer 1500, or you can use basically any light gray paint. I just mixed a few drops of black into some white paint because it's cheaper than using my good primer. As you can see, that dried salt looks just as bad on the model as it does on a real car. For my southern viewers, this is what the cars look like up north for like half the winter. Note that while I'm priming this, I'm trying to stay away from the rusty holes in the bottom of the fenders and the quarter panels. Just like a real rust hole, there's a good chance that both the paint and primer are already gone from those spots. These are the spots that look like they should be the worst. You can put a second coat of light primer on your model if you want. It really just depends on what vision you have for your build. Like how old it is, how much original paint is left, if it was well cared for, and so on. But remember, the more primer you put on, the more work it's going to be to have to get it back down to that bare metal layer. So you might not want it too thick. For this wagon, it was washed and waxed regularly for the first few years, and then gradually as time went on it just kind of got forgotten about. When I weather a model, I also create a story for it like this. Was it a farmer's truck? Maybe it was a businessman's car. Maybe it was some kid's first car. Maybe it got snowed on all the time, or maybe it was in the Southwest getting sunbaked. Think about how your friends and family took care of their cars over the years and how they changed, how they looked different over the time. This helps me and it'll help you too. Think of those things and then you can decide how it should be weathered and to what degree. Now it's time for some paint. I won't say that this is the perfect color to show all the weathering, but it's the color I wanted for my story. A teenager can easily look at a color like this and dream about how it's going to look with some fresh paint and how cool it's going to be. But being a darker shade, many things won't show quite as well as they would with a lighter color. But this is my and my teenage buddy's build, and we want it blue. For what we're doing, a water-based acrylic look works good. Again, I try to stay away from the rust holes, just letting the overspray get a little close. On real cars, there can be a lot of different looks ranging from the color stopping right at the rust hole to being a foot away from the major rust. There is no real right or wrong way to do this, but there are places on an older car where the paint can still be in decent shape, no matter how rusty or sun-faded the car may be. Typically, the freshest looking paint is going to be in the natural shadows, like below the molding line on the doors and the fenders. Much of the rust comes up from the bottom of the car. I can't tell you how many times I've seen the bottoms of fenders looking fine, but really only the paint was holding it all together. Touch it and you just made a hole. Now this isn't part of the weathering process, it's just me being clumsy. But if it helps, why not? In case you're wondering, You can do this with a rattle can. There are some differences though. It'll be harder to keep the paint away from the rust holes, but you can do it. Take a piece of paper towel and wet it. Ball it up and make little balls, and then put those where you don't want paint. Think spitballs. The water will keep it in place while you're painting, plus the paint won't stick to the water or the wet primer. Easy peasy. The biggest difference is the rattle can may take longer to dry before you can do the next step. Here we go. Now it's time to start seeing some of those results. If you remember, the hood had mostly white glue. You can start with a toothbrush or a scrub brush, but it's a slow process because the water has to reach the glue to start dissolving it. You can take a needle or the tip of an X-Acto blade to puncture it, and it'll go a smidgen faster, but you have to be careful that you don't actually scrape it or dig down too deep into it, back to the original primers, or worse, the bare plastic. And you also don't want to just toss it into a bowl of water and hope it dissolves. The longer water sits on a water-based paint, the more you risk of it all getting soft and removing more of the paint than you actually wanted it to. I know some of you wanted to see the difference between the salt and glue, so I thought this was the perfect chance to do that. You can put the glue exactly where you want it, which is nice. And the glue tends to make bigger spots. That's something you need to keep in mind. Like I said, it all depends on the look and the effect you want. With the glue, sometimes it also feels like I have to scrape it off. Like it's wet, but it's not all coming off and it's still a little bit there. Just kind of funny feeling. And when it's wet, you really can't see if you got it all off or not. Usually when you do a little bit of sanding after the brushes, it becomes a lot easier to tell. As I move to the salted areas, you may notice that you start seeing the effects faster. That's because the salt will dissolve a whole lot faster than the glue will. You don't have to do the random sprinkles of salt like I did. You can use a Q-tip or a damp corner of a paper towel to just dampen certain spots. Like maybe behind the wheels if you're building something that travels down a gravel road a lot. Plus you can get different sizes of salt and mix it up a little bit for some different effects and random bigger splotches. The salt is also a lot easier to wipe off the areas that you don't want it. With the glue, you have to wipe it off, then wet to clean the residue off, and then let that dry. Then you can try again. I should also point out that I never use glue on cast surfaces like armored vehicles. Even the rolled armor like on a Panther, a Tiger, or modern like the Abrams, it'll still have some texture in it, and I don't like how that looks if I use the glue. Under most circumstances, I find the salt a lot easier to use. With a little clay, it can be placed exactly where you want. It dissolves faster, and with some care and sanding, I think you can get the exact look that you want a whole lot easier than you can with the glue. Now when I say faster and easier, that doesn't mean that just 5 minutes with the scrub brush and you're all done. Oh no. I'm sure you've noticed that I've speeded up these parts and I've cut quite a bit out as well. If I didn't, you'd fall asleep watching it. Plan on 30 minutes for this part, depending on how much salt and how thick the paint is. And sorry about the Tinker Pups in the background. When you feel you're done removing all the salt and glue, it's up to you to decide if that's good enough for you. For a faded paint, as well as my vision for this wagon, I need to sand it. For you armor modelers out there, you can't just add some white paint to dull it down, especially with metallic paints like this. Sanding is the best way to get that effect. It also changes the salt effect. The reason it's called chipping is because that's what it looks like, and that's what usually happens with armored vehicles. Cars usually get chips only on the front of the hood and maybe a little bit behind the wheels. Much of the weathering on cars comes from the paint wearing out and the sun. Clear coats didn't start appearing on cars until the 80s, so something like this didn't have a whole lot of paint protection. And you've all seen what the sun can do to the paint on everything else around your house. Just take a look around and you'll see things that are faded on one side because it faces the sun, and things that look brand new on the other side because it didn't face the sun. So I sand to create the effect of the sun bleaching the color out, and the rest of the damage that it does to the paint. I will typically use 1500 grit wet and dry sandpaper for this. 1200 is okay too, but you really don't want to go anything coarser than 1000 grit. It cuts too fast. The water helps prevent the sandpaper from clogging up, as well as continuing to rinse off any salt or glue. But the paper clogging is really the main reason. You want to make sure you get all the surfaces that are in direct sunlight. The roof, the hood, the trunk, and then start on the upper sides of the fenders, the doors, the quarter panels, that kind of stuff. Extra care needs to be taken on the sharp corners or edges. Going through the paint is fine, natural in fact. But when you see that red-brown color of the metallic look that we were trying to put, it's time to stay away. And that's also why I put the flat clear over the red-brown, to give me a little bit extra buffer so I don't go down to the bare plastic. Remember, this will be your vision of the car, so sand as much or as little as you like. Also, there isn't much need to sand below the molding lines other than to remove some paint around from the rust holes, some of that overspray that got blown on there. Just a few passes to knock down a little bit of the gloss that might be there. What I really like about sanding it like this is how it shows the layers. As the paint is being sanded away, you can see the primer showing more and more, making those little rust spots grow, just like they do over time on the real cars. It makes it show how the years under the sun has lightened and actually thinned out the paint and the color. All the times it was washed, or the snow brushed off, grocery bags set on the outside, set on the roof, set on the fenders, maybe even the kids climbing on it. The little chips that grow over time. Rust attacks the paint from the bottom, and the other things like the sun attack from the top. And the sanding helps to get that look. If you remember back in part 2, I put some bare metal foil on some of the emblems that were faint. Now is the time to hit those too. I take a little strip of the sandpaper and I wrap it over a pencil eraser so I can have a little bit more control over it. This is actually the first time I've done this, and I'm fairly impressed with the results. It's not perfect, and it didn't get them all to turn out the way that I would have liked, but it's a lot better than I probably would have gotten with bare metal foil after the paint. You don't have to do this on every model or every emblem. It's just nice to know you have another option in your toolbox. Alright, this is what it looks like now before we do the rest of the weathering. Rust on the back quarter panel is showing off real good. Stuff on the front's pretty good, and I'll have some overhead shots
just after this. A lot of nice defects in the paint, and that quarter panel looks absolutely great. You can also see how some of the fine emblems were able to stand out very, very well with putting the bare metal foil on first. And I'm pretty excited to get to the last and final part of the weathering on this. I bet you guys are too, since I've drug this series out so long. Alright. Enjoy the stills at the end of this, and we'll see you soon on Pappy Tinkers.